I went outside with the taste of coffee still on my tongue and the day's grit under my nails. The wind had turned colder, and that meant tools left out would sweat and pit by morning. I told myself I was only stepping out to stash the hand maul, the fencing pliers, and the socket set I'd used on the tractor. That was all. A simple loop from kitchen to porch to shed and back. The kind of thing a widower did to keep his hands busy when the house got too quiet. I swung the screen door open, and it slapped the frame harder than I meant, a sharp crack that made my heart jump. The porch light buzzed awake. Fog rolled in from the creek like breath. I took 2 steps, already planning where the tools would hang, and then the bench under the front window came into the light. Something massive sat there, perfectly still, like it had been part of my porch for years and I was the one arriving late. For a second, my mind tried bear, drifter, stump, anything ordinary, but the shape breathed once, slow, and the air around it seemed to wait. Most folks around these parts put Bigfoot in the same bucket as ghost lights and lucky mining claims. They laughed, then glanced over their shoulders just in case. I had laughed too, years back, when Claire was alive and the world still felt wide. But the thing on my bench was taller than my doorway, shoulders broad as a stacked bale, hair dark with fog. My fingers tightened around the pliers until the metal bit my skin. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for a growl. Instead, it turned its head with the slow courtesy of an old man at church and looked at me. The eyes were not wild. They were steady, watchful, tired. "Don't be afraid," it said, and the words were English, plain and careful. "Sit." My name is Mark Cooper. I was 56, a small-time farmer tucked against the Northern California timber, the kind of man who measured a life in fence posts, feed sacks, and storms survived. I didn't go chasing mysteries. I fixed what broke. After Claire died in a white-walled hospital, I filled evenings with chores. Because if my hands stopped moving, my thoughts would not, and I feared them most. I set the pliers on the porch rail, palms up where it could see them, and eased myself onto the bench. The wood was cold through my jeans. Up close, I smelled damp cedar, rich soil, and something faintly sweet like crushed fern. The creature's hands rested on its knees, long fingers blunt to the tips, nails worn down as if by stone. It had scars on one forearm, pale lines beneath hair. For a moment, we just listened, the creek whispering below the pasture, a cow shifting in the dark, the porch light humming. Then it touched its chest and said, "Moss." One word, like a name earned. It pointed at me, waiting. "Mark," I managed. My voice sounded thin in the fog. Moss nodded once, as if we had completed a necessary step. "I learned your sounds, from your house, from your radio, from hunters." The words came slowly, but they landed true. "I don't come close, not unless it matters." I swallowed and asked, "Why does it matter tonight?" Moss looked past barn toward the timberline, the way you look at weather building. "Because balance is breaking, and eyes are coming." It started with the land. Moss spoke like someone who had been walking the same ridges longer than my family had owned deeds. It asked if I remembered when the hillside north of my place carried oak, manzanita, pine, and pockets of wildflowers. I did, though I hadn't thought of it in years. "Now it is one thing," Moss said. "Rows, sheets, one hunger." He used his finger to draw parallel lines in the dirt between our boots. "One crop is easy for machines. It makes a thin world." I tried to defend it the way farmers do. Banks wanted predictability, markets punished variety, and a man had to keep up. Moss listened and then asked a question I couldn't bill to anyone. Keep up with what? It described insects that used to rise in clouds at dusk and the swallows that followed. "When you make one plant, you erase 10 foods," it said. When 10 foods go, the small ones go, then the hunters go, then the soil goes. I felt the chain, link by link, tightening around my own choices. Fog thickened, and I pictured those links running from my fence line into the timber. Moss's voice stayed calm, but its nose wrinkled when it talked about the bitter water. It nodded toward the small shed where I kept herbicide and insecticide, locked like a gun cabinet. You think poison has borders, it travels. It told me about a spring storm years back, when rain pounded hard enough that my gutters roared. Moss watched the runoff turn the ditch into a moving ribbon, carrying foam and stink down to the creek. Frogs floated, it said, eyes narrowing. I remembered that storm. I also remembered telling myself the dead frogs must have been from something else, because admitting the truth would have meant changing. Moss lifted a handful of dirt from the path and let it fall through his fingers. Soil should smell like life. Yours smells sharp after you spray. I hated that it was right. My thumb rubbed the callus at my wedding ring finger, a habit from when the ring used to be there. I'm trying to feed people, I said. Moss looked at me and answered softly, You are feeding a system, not a home. It tapped the bench once, sealing the sentence. After the land, Moss moved to people, as if the two were the same wound. You have more ways to speak, but you stand farther apart. It described the gas station in town, how men lined up for coffee, eyes fixed on glowing screens in their palms, never meeting. It described families in pickup trucks, each face lit blue by a phone, silence thicker than exhaust. I wanted to say folks were tired, that life was expensive, that worry made a man narrow. Moss nodded like it had already heard that excuse on 100 radios. Tired is not the problem, it said. Forgetting is. It asked me when I last sat with an old person and listened without looking at a clock. The question slid under my ribs. My father had taught me to fix a gate latch by feel and to smell rain before it arrived, but in his last year I visited like a man paying a bill. Moss said humans used to keep elders close because elders carried maps. Now you store them, it said, and the word store sounded like a nail driven straight. I stared at my boots, ashamed of the truth. Moss watched my face the way I watched clouds. You lost your mate, it said, not asking. My throat tightened, and I nodded once. I could have lied, could have acted hard, but the night was too quiet for pretending. Claire had been the kind of woman who wiped her hands on her apron and helped without questions. After she died, I locked my door earlier, drove into town less, and let friendships fade like paint. Moss called that shrinking. You build walls, it said, then you wonder why you cannot be warmed. It told me its own elders walked in the middle of the group, protected, listened to, never left behind. Slow ones carry stories, it said. Stories keep a people alive. I thought of the church potlucks we used to attend, the way neighbors fixed a roof together without invoices. I had stopped showing up because I didn't want anyone's pity, but what I really feared was kindness. Moss said humans were practicing loneliness the way they practiced speed. You cannot remember how to help if you never stand close enough to feel another person's weight. An owl called once, and the sound felt like agreement. Moss asked about the hedgerow I'd burned the previous spring, the one that used to snag my sleeves when I drove the baler along the edge. I told it the thicket made the run crooked, cost me time, and hid gophers. Moss's mouth tightened. Crooked is where life hides, it said. It described quail dusting in the shade, rabbits slipping through, insects laying eggs on wild weeds I called trash. You cut it because it slowed you, Moss said, and then you wonder why your fields need more poison. I felt heat rise in my face. I remembered the afternoon I lit that pile, smoke rolling up while I watched, satisfied, as if order was virtue. Moss lifted its mug and looked at the chipped rim. "Your people love clean lines," it said. "The forest is not clean, it is layered." It pressed its palm to the ground. "Under this is food for roots. Under roots is water. Under water is stone. Take one layer away and you carry the debt." I asked what debt meant to a creature. Moss answered, "A debt is what your grandchildren pay." The word hung between us, heavier than a sack of feed I'd carried. Then Moss spoke about trust, the way a man talks about water in a dry year. "You used to share," it said. "Now you hide." It asked why my gate had a new chain and why my porch camera faced the driveway. I told it about break-ins on the highway, about news stories that made fear feel like weather. Moss nodded as if it understood fear, but not the habit of feeding it. "One man locks a door," it said, "then another does, until a town forgets what open means." I thought of the feed store, where we used to lean on basics and argue about rain. Now we paid fast and left. I thought of Claire at the counter, slipping extra eggs into a neighbor's carton when she heard their kid was sick. After she died, I stopped giving, because giving meant admitting I still needed something back. Moss watched me turn the mug in my hands. "You are practicing suspicion," it said, "the way you practice planting." It leaned closer, voice gentle. "When the real storm comes, who will you call if you have trained everyone not to answer?" I had no reply, only the creak of trees. We had talked long enough that my yard felt smaller, an island under one porch bulb. My tools still lay where I'd dropped them. Moss followed my glance. "Put them away," it said. "Keep your ritual. It steadies you." I stood, legs stiff, and carried the maul and pliers to the shed, moving as if every sound could travel. Hooks clinked. The door sighed. When I returned, Moss hadn't moved. It stared past my mailbox to the dirt road curling down the valley. "They are closer," it said, "people who do not come to share." I asked how it knew. Moss traced a slow circle in the air, then flattened its palm, pressing an invisible lens. "Eyes that see heat, eyes that fly." My stomach tightened. I knew the word drone, but I'd never heard one here. Moss leaned in, voice lower. "When the balance breaks, the loud ones arrive first. They will call you neighbor, then they will call you liar." Far off, an engine rose and stopped. The silence after sounded like a gate latch clicking. Moss stood, taller than my porch post, and faded into the fog. I remained on the bench, listening to it. Moss stepped out of the porch light the way a man steps behind a barn post when a truck rolls by. No drama, just instinct. For a few seconds, all I could see was fog, and the darker fog of the trees beyond my pasture. I stayed on the bench with my shoulders tight, listening to my own breathing, half expecting the night to snap back into its normal shape. Then the porch boards creaked once, soft. Moss was still there, only sitting in the shadow at the edge of the light, where the yellow didn't reach its face. It hadn't left. It had simply made itself smaller in the only way something that large could, by borrowing darkness. "Lights draw eyes," it said, "even when the eyes are far." I nodded like I understood, though the truth was, I was still trying to convince my hands not to shake. My mug had gone lukewarm. The fog had thickened until my fence line looked like it had been erased. The porch light buzzed overhead, and every now and then a moth struck it with a tiny, desperate tick. "You said your name is Moss," I reminded myself out loud, like saying it might anchor me. "And you said,
Eyes are coming." Moss made a sound that might have been agreement. It watched the road past my mailbox again, then returned its attention to me. "You asked why I came," it said. "I told you part. The other part is, you cannot hear what matters when your world is full of noise." It waited a beat, as if letting that settle, then continued. "I watched your kind make boxes, and then make your lives fit inside them." I let out a short breath through my nose, not quite a laugh. "Phones," I said. Moss tilted its head. "Phones, television, the talking box in your truck. Always sound, always light." I knew what it meant. After Claire died, I kept the kitchen radio on for company, even when I wasn't listening. I left the television muttering in the living room because silence felt like a room with no floor. I hadn't admitted that to anyone, not even myself, until a creature on my porch said it out loud. Moss pointed toward my window, where the dark glass held a faint reflection of us. "You sit with other humans," it said, "but your faces look into the small light. Your mouths move, but your eyes are not together." I tried to argue the practical side of it, weather apps, calling the vet, keeping track of feed prices. Moss didn't disagree. It wasn't condemning the tool. It was talking about the way we clung to it. "You use the box to avoid the moment you are in," Moss said. "You call it connection, but it steals your listening." The porch boards felt colder under my boots. Somewhere down the hill, the creek made a thin, steady sound like a whisper through dry lips. I realized I hadn't heard crickets in a while. Or maybe I just hadn't been quiet enough to notice. Moss leaned forward, elbows on its knees, voice low. "Your kind used to sit in the evening and hear the world," it said. "Owls, wind, the small feet in grass. Now you fill the dark with music and talking so you don't hear yourself." That one landed in me like a hand on the shoulder. I stared at the pliers I'd set on the porch rail, the metal dull in the light. Claire used to hum while she washed dishes. When she died, the hum died too, and I replaced it with a radio because admitting I missed the hum felt like opening a wound. "You're telling me we're addicted," I said. Moss's eyes narrowed slightly, as if it was choosing a word from a shelf it had stocked over years of listening. "You are dependent," it said, "on noise, on speed, on being distracted from what hurts." I sat with that, letting the fog press in around my yard like cotton. A far-off dog barked once, then stopped, as if it had second thoughts. Moss watched my face, patient as weather. "You call it progress," Moss went on, "but I watched you become more tired." It lifted a hand and made a slow sweeping motion, taking in my shed, my truck, my barn, the fence line that had taken me 2 weekends to tighten last spring. "Machines should make life lighter," it said, "but your shoulders look heavier than your father's." I swallowed. My father had worked with less equipment, that was true. He'd fixed things with wire and stubbornness. He'd gone to bed early, not because he was lazy, but because his days ended when daylight ended. Mine stretched into the night under LEDs and deadlines. "Everything is faster," Moss said. "Food fast, work fast, driving fast. Even your talking is fast." It looked at my mug. "Tea is made to be waited for," it said. And there was something almost like humor in the way it said it, dry, not playful. "But your kind drinks while walking. You do not let anything finish." I thought about the way I ate standing at the counter now, plates rarely making it to the table since Claire was gone. I thought about microwaved meals and drive-through coffee. I thought about my own impatience with slow things, slow calves, slow repairs, slow conversations that wandered. "You lose the long view," Moss said. "When everything is quick, you cannot see what your quickness breaks." A gust of wind rattled the porch railing. The fog shifted, and for a second I saw the outline of the far pasture gate before it vanished again. Moss's voice dipped lower. "In the winter," it said, "I remember winters here, when the creek sang loud and the snow stayed." I looked up at that. It wasn't speaking in generalities now. It was talking about my valley, my seasons. "Back when I was a kid, we got snow most years," I said. "Not much, but enough to make the cattle act stupid." Moss nodded once. "Snow is less," it said. "Heat comes sooner. The water leaves sooner." He held out a palm, flat, as if feeling for something in the air. "The summer air used to be different," it said. "Now it burns earlier. The trees thirst longer." I thought about the last few years, how the creek had dropped by July, how my alfalfa looked tired before the second cutting, how the hills turned the color of old paper by June.
I'd complained about it like a farmer complains, as if complaining was the same as understanding. Hearing Moss name it felt different, like being told your house is leaning and you're still hanging pictures. "You humans live short," Moss said. "Short life makes you think today is normal." It paused, and the pause itself had weight. A child sees one hot summer and thinks it is how summers are, but the land remembers longer. My fingers tightened around my mug again. I could hear Claire in my head, the way she used to talk about her childhood winters, how the creek froze at the edges. I'd shrugged it off as nostalgia. Moss looked toward the timberline. "When the pattern changes slowly," it said, "you accept it. That is how you fall." "Fall where?" I asked, though my gut already knew the shape of the answer. Moss drew a line in the dirt with a fingertip, then another line beside it, closer. Then it angled the lines forward until they converged. "You run," it said. "Your kind runs through a dark forest, faster each year. You think running is survival." It lifted its finger and stopped it abruptly in the air. "But ahead is a cliff," it said, "and when the running becomes a flub, no one can stop." The porch light buzzed a little louder, or maybe my ears had sharpened. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Moss wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to make me see what it had seen. "You're saying we can't slow down," I said. Moss's gaze stayed steady. "You could," it said, "but you do not practice slowing. You practice speed, so when you need to slow, your muscles do not obey." I let that sit. The fog made our yard feel like the world had shrunk to one bench and one light. I thought of the men in town who talked about getting ahead like it was the only prayer. Moss took another sip of tea, then said, "And now you do not trust each other enough to face it together." That was the last theme, but it didn't feel like a new topic. It felt like the knot all the other ropes fed into. "Your fences are higher," Moss said, nodding toward my pasture. "Your locks are stronger. Your eyes watch cameras. Your hands hold weapons." I felt my jaw clench. "People are cautious," I said. "There's crime. There's—" Moss lifted a hand, palm out, not interrupting so much as steadying the conversation. "Fear is not new," it said, "but your fear has become a habit." It leaned closer, and the smell of damp cedar returned, grounding me. "A man fears a storm," it said, "so he builds shelter. That is wise. But your kind fears each other, so you build walls between hearts. That is different." I stared at the chain I'd added to my gate after Claire died. It had felt like protection. Now it looked like a symbol I hadn't meant to hang. "When real trouble comes," Moss said, "you will need hands, many hands, but you teach each other not to reach." My throat tightened. I thought of neighbors I hadn't checked on when their barn light stayed off too long.
I thought of the way grief made me avoid kindness, like kindness was a debt I couldn't afford. Moss watched me with something that looked like sadness, or maybe it was simply patience that had outlived disappointment. "I did not come to shame you," it said. "I came because what is coming will test what you practice." I finally asked the question that had been circling since the moment I stepped onto my porch. "What do you want from me?" Moss didn't answer right away. It turned its head toward the valley road again, listening. In the silence, I heard it too, very faint, high and steady, like a mosquito made of metal. Moss's eyes tracked something I couldn't see through the fog. "It is here sometimes," it said, "the flying eye." A drone, I thought. My stomach turned. "They will come closer. People with equipment, people who want proof. They will not come with empty hands." I felt cold settle under my ribs. "And you're telling me because you live between," Moss said simply. It tapped the bench between us, then pointed toward the woods. "You are not deep forest. You are not town. You are the edge." It held his hand out, palm up, as if offering me something invisible. "I need you to understand what your people do when they hunt with rules. I need you to help me learn the signs, the sounds, the ways they trap without rope." I stared at his open palm, at the thick fingers that could have snapped my wrist like a dry stick, and I felt the strange steadiness of being asked, truly asked, like an equal. "I can't stop the world," I said. Moss nodded like it expected that. "Do not stop the world," it said. "Help me avoid the worst of it. Help my family stay unseen when unseen is safety." Family. The word hit harder than all the talk about climate and speed, because I could hear in it a simple thing. Someone else could lose what I lost. The high whine in the distance rose, then dipped, then rose again. The fog above my pasture brightened for half a second, as if something passed overhead, blocking starlight I couldn't even see. Moss stood, and the porch boards groaned. It didn't tower over me in threat. It towered like a tree does, present, indifferent to your feelings, but not cruel. "Tomorrow," it said, "when you walk your fence line, look up, listen for the thin sound. If you hear it, do not stand in open places." It stepped back into the fog, but this time it didn't vanish all at once. I saw it move, one slow stride, then another, choosing the dark like a man choosing a doorway. Before it disappeared, it turned its head slightly and said, "You asked if humans can change. Change begins when one man hears truth and doesn't turn on the radio to drown it." Then it was gone.
I stayed on my porch with my mug cooling in my hands, staring at the yard that felt suddenly exposed. The thin sound faded into the valley, replaced by the old noises of night, the creek, the wind, the occasional shift of cattle in their sleep. But the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was watchful. The next morning I woke before the sun, the way I always did, but the habit felt different, as if someone had moved the furniture in my head while I slept. The house was cold. Claire's side of the bed stayed smooth, the way it had for 2 years, and I stared at it longer than I meant to. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee and didn't turn on the radio. My hand hovered over the knob out of muscle memory, then dropped to my side. The silence had a shape now. It wasn't empty. It was full of things I'd been drowning out. Outside, the fog had lifted into a thin gray veil, and everything in the yard was wet. The porch steps, the fence rails, the hood of my truck. I walked to the shed with my boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud, and I caught myself looking up, not at clouds, but at the open slice of sky over the pasture. Moss had said the thin sound would come. I listened for it like you listen for a calf's bawl when you're not sure it's still breathing. I did my chores slowly on purpose. Water trough, feed, a quick walk along the south fence where the ground tended to slump after rain. I kept pausing, pretending to check staples while my ears stayed tuned to the air. It made me feel foolish, like a man jumping at shadows, but it also made me aware of how loud my own routine was. The clink of a chain, the slam of a gate, the cough of my truck when I turned the key. Halfway down the pasture, near the bend where the creek dropped into alder shade, I heard it. Not loud, not even close. A thin, steady whine that didn't belong to any bird or bug. It rose, dipped, and came back again, a clean, mechanical note that carried in a way natural sounds didn't. My first instinct was to stand there like a stubborn idiot and look for it. My second instinct, quieter, older, was to step under the nearest oak and freeze. I felt my throat tighten, as if the air had suddenly gotten thin. The cattle didn't notice. They kept chewing, tails flicking, as if a flying eye meant nothing to them. The sound drifted nearer. I didn't see it at first because the sun hadn't cleared the ridge and the sky was still the color of dishwater. Then a small dark dot crossed over the far end of the field, paused, and traced a slow circle like it was sniffing. My skin prickled. I thought about the porch, about Moss sitting under my window like a guest, and the calm way it had said, "They will not come with empty hands." The drone, because I couldn't call it anything else, hovered for a moment, and I had the odd sensation of being looked at without being seen. That made it worse, not better. When you see eyes, you can bargain with them. A deer will bolt, a hawk will decide. This thing just hung there, patient and tireless, and the whine sank into my bones. I stayed under the oak until it drifted on toward the timberline. When it was gone, the world didn't feel normal again. It felt like someone had left a gate open. I walked back to the porch with my shoulders tight and my mind running through possibilities the way it ran through broken equipment. Who, why, and how long until it came back. When I reached the porch, I looked at the small camera I'd mounted over the door after Claire died.
It faced the driveway, blinking its tiny red light like a heartbeat. I'd told myself it was safety. Standing there, thinking about unseen eyes in the sky, I understood how quickly safety could become bait. I took the camera down and set it on the kitchen table like a dead thing. I didn't feel brave doing it. I felt exposed. But I also felt a strange relief, like loosening a belt I'd worn too tight. That afternoon, I did something else that would have surprised the man I'd been 2 years earlier. I walked to the corner of my bedroom closet where the rifle lived, and I took it down. I didn't do it with ceremony, no speeches, no grand moral decision. I simply held it and felt the familiar weight, the cold reassurance of a tool that had solved problems for me before. Coyotes in the lambing season, a sick cow that needed mercy, an easy deer in November when the freezer was low and the world felt honest. I thought about Moss's words, about bitter water, about balance, about the small lives under brush. I thought about Claire slipping extra eggs into a neighbor's carton because she'd heard their kid was sick. She didn't do that because it was efficient. She did it because that's how you stayed human. I carried the rifle to the shed and locked it in the old steel cabinet behind the tool racks. Then I shoved a stack of feed sacks in front of the cabinet so I wouldn't be tempted by convenience. My hands smelled like oil when I was done. I washed them and still smelled it. The next day, a doe and her fawn showed up near the hedgerow I'd burned last spring. They stood where the thicket used to be, in open grass that offered no cover, and it struck me like an accusation. The fawn nosed at the ground, searching for something that wasn't there. I'd removed its hiding place because it slowed my bailer. My old self would have thought, "There's dinner." My old self would have watched the fawn and measured its weight in pounds. Instead, I watched their ears swivel at every sound and felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with hunger. I walked back inside and ate eggs and toast, and the meat section of my mind stayed quiet. I didn't become a saint overnight. I'm not writing this to pretend I was better than I was. Some evenings I still craved the simplicity of a clean shot and a stocked freezer, the way I craved the radio's chatter when the house got too silent. But cravings are not commands. Each time the old habit rose up, I tried to do what Moss had described, sit long enough to hear what was beneath it. If I needed protein, I bought it in town, wrapped in paper, already disconnected from the act. It wasn't pure, it wasn't perfect, but it was a shift, and the shift mattered because it changed how I moved through my own land. I started leaving the brush alone. I stopped burning every messy pile. I let a strip of weeds grow along the creek because I saw insects there again, and the sight of them felt like an apology being accepted slowly. And I kept listening. The drone came back 3 days later, and then again the week after, always mid-morning, always sweeping the edge where pasture met timber. Sometimes it dipped low enough that I could hear the whine turn sharper, like a saw biting wood. Once it hovered over the creek, and I felt a hot anger flare up in me, not because I owned the creek, but because it was being treated like a thing to scan and label. I asked around in town without making it sound like I was asking. At the feed store, I bought mineral blocks and said, casual as I could, "You seen any survey work going on up by the ridge?" The man behind the counter, Joel, shrugged. "Couple guys from downstate were in last week," he said. "Bought batteries, weird little camera gear, said they were doing wildlife mapping, university or something." "Drones?" I asked, like it was nothing. Joel smiled. "Hell, everybody's got a drone now. Hunters use 'em to scout. Realtors use 'em to sell houses no one can afford. Kids use 'em to annoy their neighbors. Why?" I shook my head. "Just seeing more of 'em," I said. "Makes the cows jumpy." He laughed and went back to his register. But as I walked out, I saw a flyer taped near the door, a local meeting about forest management and access road improvements. There was a logo I didn't recognize, some consulting company with a clean name, the kind of clean that usually meant chainsaws. The next week, I found orange flagging along my creek. It wasn't on my side of the fence exactly, not at first. It was just beyond my property line, in the timber, but close enough that I could smell the fresh-cut plastic when the wind blew right.
The flags hung from branches, like bright wounds. I followed them uphill until I heard voices, men's voices, 2 of them, calm, confident, talking about line of sight, thermal coverage, and good access. I crouched behind a manzanita and watched through leaves, my heart moving too hard in my chest. They wore clean boots and carried tripods and a case that looked like it held electronics. One of them had a tablet in his hand. The other had a handheld unit with an antenna. Not hunters, not hikers. They moved with purpose, like they were laying out a plan, not enjoying the woods. When I backed away, I stepped carefully, placing my boots where the ground was already disturbed. I felt ridiculous sneaking around on land I'd walked since I was a kid, but I also felt the truth Moss had given me. I lived on the edge, and edges were where things got noticed. That night, I left my porch light off. I sat in the dark and watched my yard through the window, not the way a paranoid man watches, but the way a man watches when he expects a storm. My hands kept drifting toward the radio and stopping. I could almost hear Moss's voice. Change begins when one man hears truth and doesn't drown it. Just after midnight, I heard a sound near the creek. 3 slow knocks, spaced apart. Not a branch fallen, not a woodpecker, a signal. It pulled me out of my chair like a hook. I didn't grab a flashlight. I didn't want a beam cutting through the dark like a finger pointing. I put on my boots, took the old canvas jacket Claire used to wear in the garden, and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold water. The stars were hidden behind thin cloud. I moved down the path toward the creek, guided by memory more than sight. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. I saw moss before I reached the water. It stood just beyond the alders, half in shadow, half in moonless gray. When it stepped forward, it did it slow enough not to spook me, like it understood I was still human and still wired for fear. "You heard," Moss said. "I heard," I answered. Moss's gaze flicked to my hands. "No weapon," it noted. "I locked it away," I said. It didn't smile exactly, but its face softened around the eyes. "You listened," it said, and the words carried something like respect. Respect felt strange coming from something so big. It made me stand straighter without meaning to. We walked along the creek together, not side by side exactly, more like two creatures sharing a line of travel. I stayed near the water where my steps were quiet. Moss moved among the brush without sound at all, and once again the impossible part wasn't its size, it was its control. I showed it the orange flags from a distance. "They're marking," I whispered, though the creek would have covered my voice anyway. Moss's nostrils flared. It watched the flags as if they were snakes. "They draw lines. Lines become machines. Machines become noise." "I had equipment," I said. "Tripods, tablets, and that drone's been circling my pasture." Moss nodded. "The flying eye is not alone," it said. "There are eyes that see heat through leaves. There are ears that hear steps. They do not come to share." I swallowed. "What do you want me to do?" Moss turned toward the darker part of the timber, and for a moment I had the impression it was listening not for people, but for other members of its own kind. Then it looked back at me. "I need you to teach me human patterns, where they stand, how they watch, what makes them stop, what makes them push." I felt the weight of it. A farmer teaching a creature from legend how to survive modern men with modern tools. If I'd heard someone say it out loud, I would have laughed. But standing there with creek water whispering past rocks, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like responsibility. "I can show you what I know," I said, "and I can keep them off my land as best I can, but I can't control what they do out there." Moss touched his chest, then made a slow motion outward with his hand, like spreading something carefully. "Then we must prepare, not react." We spent the next hour doing practical things, because practical things were what I knew. I showed Moss where the old logging road cut behind the ridge, and where a truck could come in without being seen from the valley. I pointed out the clearance where a drone would have a clean view. I told it that men with cameras liked open spaces and long sight lines. I told it that the best way to avoid a human wasn't to outrun him, it was to make him uncertain about what he'd seen. Moss listened like a student and like a teacher both. He didn't interrupt. He filed away details with a patience that made me ashamed of my own hurried mind. Then Moss asked about my brush piles, where I'd stopped burning, where I'd let weeds return along the creek. "You changed," it said. "I'm trying," I answered. Moss crouched near the water and watched a small shape skitter beneath the surface, maybe a minnow, maybe a tadpole. It held his palm low, not touching, just hovering. Small lives return when you stop killing the space they need. That was the moment it clicked for me that my decision to stop hunting wasn't just personal morality, it was communication. It was a signal to something that lived by balance that I was willing to rebalance myself. "I stopped killing what I don't have to," I said quietly. Moss looked at me for a long time. Then it did something that surprised me. It leaned forward and tapped the back of my hand once with 2 fingers. Gentle, brief, like a handshake made simpler. "You will need that choice soon." On the walk back toward my place, we heard the thine whine again, faint but present.
Moss froze instantly, and I followed its stillness. The sound hovered somewhere above the ridge. We didn't look up. Looking up felt like inviting it. Moss's mouth moved without sound for a second, like it was counting. Then it stepped off the path and vanished into brush so quickly I couldn't track where it went, even though I was staring. It wasn't magic, it was skill. The kind of skill that comes from generations of not being found. I stayed where I was, under alder shadow, and waited until the wine drifted away. When I turned, Moss was there again, as if the creek had produced it. They practice searching. Every day, they get better. We do too, I said, and the words came out before I could decide if I believed them. Moss looked at me, and in that look I felt the line tightening, the line between hiding and being discovered, between doing nothing and doing something that would change my life again. When they come closer, you must decide if you are only a man who watches or a man who acts. I thought of Claire, how she acted without speeches. I thought of my father, how he'd taught me to stand by my work. I thought of the orange flags bright against dark bark, and I felt a quiet anger harden into something steadier.
"I'll act," I said, "but we do it smart. We do it slow." Moss nodded once. "Slow is how you survive storms," it said. "Fast is how you fall." Before it left, Moss pointed toward my porch, the bench under the window. "No more talking there," it said. "Too exposed." "Where then?" I asked. Moss touched its chest. "I will call," it said. "3 knocks. You will come to water." It turned its head toward the ridge where the drone had been. "And you will prepare your mind, because soon hiding will not be enough." When it stepped away, it didn't vanish like a trick. It moved like an animal that knew every root and shadow. I watched until I couldn't see it. Then I stood alone with the creek and the damp smell of alder. Back at the house, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with my hands wrapped around a cold mug, watching the faint outline of my yard. I kept thinking about the men with tripods and tablets, about the way they talked like the forest was a chart. I kept thinking about Moss tapping my hand like a promise. By dawn, I had made a list in my head the way I made lists before calving season. Practical, unromantic, necessary. Talk to Joel again, but carefully. Find out who those men were. Watch the ridge for more flagging. Move my cattle away from the timber edge so their tracks wouldn't mix with anything else. Keep my porch light off. Keep my mouth shut. And most of all, keep my rifle locked away, because I had the sick feeling that if things went bad, the quickest mistake would be the one that ruined everything. When the sun finally crept over the ridge, painting the fog pink for a brief minute, I heard trucks in the distance, 2 of them, maybe 3, grinding up the old road where nobody should have been driving that early. The sound wasn't close yet, but it was real. It was the start of something that didn't care about my routines, my grief, or my private agreement with a creature the world insisted was a myth. I stood at my window and watched the tree line, and I understood, with a calm that felt like cold water, the edge I lived on had become a front line. By the 3rd morning, the trucks stopped pretending they were just passing through. I heard them before I saw them, low gears grinding on the old logging road, diesel hanging in the cold air like a warning. From my kitchen window, I watched 2 pickups and a white SUV crawl along the ridge, then vanish behind fir. No one waved. No one stopped at my gate to ask permission. They were working a plan, not meeting a neighbor. I moved my cattle away from the timber edge and tamped down every habit that made me visible. No porch light, no radio, truck tucked behind the barn. And when dusk came, I waited for the creek to speak. 3 knocks, spaced slow. I went down without a flashlight, boots finding the path by memory. The creek smelled thin, less snowmelt these days, and the alders dripped on my shoulders. Moss stood in the shadow like a stump that could breathe. He didn't waste words. "They set a camp," he said. He led me along the water, keeping low where the bank rose. 20 minutes later, we looked down into an old landing, an open bowl of ground that used to hold logs. Now it held men. 2 tents, a generator, shielded work lights pointed at cases and tripods. One man swung a thermal unit like a lantern. Another cradled a drone as carefully as if it were a living thing. Near a folding table, under canvas, were 2 rigid shapes, metal frames that didn't belong to camping. "Cages," I whispered. Moss's jaw tightened. "Caught," he said, and drew a rectangle in the mud with one thick finger, then smaller rectangles inside it, then a circle like a head, and hands closing like doors. The men laughed once loud and careless, and it made my stomach turn. They weren't there to learn. They were there to own a story. Moss leaned in. "Help us make them leave," he said. I tasted rust in my mouth. I thought of Claire in that hospital room, how machines had filled the air while her hand cooled under mine. I thought of my father's last year, tucked into a place that smelled like bleach, his stories going stale because nobody had time, and I thought of those cages waiting. "We don't hurt anyone," I said. Moss nodded once, agreement.
We watched their rhythm. Who checked what? When they got lazy. When they drank coffee and looked at screens instead of trees. Around 2 in the morning, one man zipped into a tent. Another wandered to the cooler. The drone stayed in its case. The generator sat at the edge of camp, vibrating like a heart. "That's their heartbeat," I whispered. "No power, no confidence." Moss understood heartbeat. He repeated it softly, like he was storing the word. When a gust of fog slid into the landing, I crawled along the creek bank, palms in wet grit, knees complaining. The generator was louder up close, heat rolling off the metal. I waited until nobody looked my way, then reached under the casing and pinched the fuel line against a bracket, just enough to starve it later, not enough to look cut. I loosened the spark plug wire a hair. Small failures, the kind a mechanic curses, not a man reports. I backed away like you back away from a sleeping bull. Moss was beside me again without a sound. His eyes tracked the camp. The generator coughed 20 minutes later. Lights flickered. A man swore. Another came out half-dressed. They crowded the machine with flashlights, arguing, yanking cords, kicking. Then Moss did his part. From the timber beyond the landing came 3 deep knocks, slow, deliberate, not random, not wind, a message with weight behind it. The men froze. One swung the thermal unit toward the trees. Another lifted a phone and waved it in the air like it could summon signal. Their screens dimmed as the generator stuttered. The drone battery warmer went dead. Their modern bravery began to leak out. A branch snapped high up, then another. Not the quick crack of falling wood, more like a measured break, as if someone strong was showing restraint. The generator died. Sudden silence flooded back in. Creek, insects, the faint hiss of fog. Headlamps made the men look small and sickly. One of them drew a handgun, and my throat tightened, but Moss stayed calm, too calm. He wasn't hunting them. He was teaching them they weren't in charge. A heavy footfall landed in mud behind the camp, far enough to be unseen, close enough to be felt. The men spun, lights darting, voices rising into each other. Fear made them sloppy. Sloppy made them tired. Over the next 2 nights we kept it up, never the same way twice. A clogged filter, a drained battery, a case tipped into mud because the table suddenly wobbled, and always, at the edge of their cleared ground, one unmistakable print pressed into wet earth like a signature. By the fourth day, the laughter was gone, sleep was thinner, tempers were short. A man in a clean jacket arrived, surveyed the landing, and spoke with the flat anger of someone whose funding hated surprises. That afternoon, the tents came down. By dusk, the landing was empty, except for tire tracks and crushed grass. The cages were gone. The generator was gone. The men were gone. The forest breathed again, cautious but real. That night the 3 knocks came, closer, gentler. At the creek, Moss waited with others behind him, shapes moving in the timber, one smaller and quick, another older and heavy. They didn't step into the open. They didn't need to. I could feel them watching. Moss touched his chest. "Moss," he said. I answered, "Mark." One by one, they made the same gesture, hand to chest, then outward towards me. Not gratitude like humans show it, something quieter, something that meant we will remember. A smaller one approached and placed a bundle on a flat rock. Smooth river stones, a feather, a piece of wood carved by tooth and time. Then, from inside the bundle, it produced an old photograph. My breath caught. It was me, young, grinning beside my first pickup. Claire stood at my shoulder, hair blown wild. Behind us, my porch bench looked brand new. That photo had been missing for years. Moss watched my face. "We watched," he said, "long." I held the picture like it could crumble, and the creek kept whispering. The world would have demanded proof and brought cages back, so I did the only thing that made sense. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my lights low. I kept my life slower. And on some foggy evenings, when I went out to put my tools away, a smooth river stone would be waiting on that bench, quiet as a promise.